Paul McCartney has spent more than 6 decades writing songs that have become part of the soundtrack of several generations. From the Beatles to his solo career, his melodies have reached an audience few songwriters in history have ever matched. But even after becoming one of the most celebrated songwriters of all time, McCartney never stopped being a fan. Throughout his career, he has spoken warmly about other writers who inspired him, challenged him, and sometimes even made him wish he had written the song himself. Here are 3 songwriters who earned some of McCartney's highest praise. Number 1. Brian Wilson. There are few songs that have impressed Paul McCartney as deeply as the Beach Boys' God Only Knows. McCartney has long admired Brian Wilson's songwriting, and his appreciation for the song goes far beyond simply calling it a classic. He once explained that God Only Knows was the kind of song that made people say, "I wish I'd written that." And for McCartney, it was exactly that. He described the song as a personal favorite and recalled how the Beatles had been inspired by the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds. The friendly rivalry between the two groups helped push the Beatles to think bigger about what a pop record could become. But God Only Knows affected McCartney on a much more personal level. He later recalled that when he performed the song with Wilson, he became emotional during the rehearsal. The combination of the lyrics, melody, and harmonies was simply overwhelming for him. That says a lot about Wilson's place in McCartney's musical world. Paul McCartney had already written some of the most famous songs ever recorded. Yet Brian Wilson could still create a song that made him stop and think, "I wish I'd written that."
But God Only Knows was always a real favorite of mine.
Number 2. John Lennon. The second name is perhaps the most obvious, but also the most complicated. John Lennon wasn't simply another songwriter Paul McCartney admired. He was his songwriting partner, his friend, his rival, and one of the most important creative forces in his entire life. Together, Lennon and McCartney created a songwriting partnership that transformed popular music. But behind the famous Lennon-McCartney name was a relationship filled with competition, disagreement, friendship, and mutual respect. Even decades after the Beatles ended, McCartney continued to talk about what made working with Lennon so special. In a 2016 interview with NPR, Paul explained that John was the person he most missed working with, because what they had was almost impossible to recreate. They had met as teenagers and then experienced much of their lives together. Their relationship wasn't built only around songwriting. It was built around growing up together, becoming famous together, and changing the course of music together. That history made Lennon irreplaceable. McCartney could collaborate with countless talented musicians after the Beatles, but there could only ever be one John Lennon. And perhaps that's why his admiration for Lennon feels different from his admiration for other songwriters. Brian Wilson could inspire Paul. Bob Dylan could challenge him. But John Lennon was someone who had been there beside him from the beginning. Number 3. Bob Dylan. Dylan's relationship with the Beatles is one of the most fascinating musical connections of the 1960s. His songwriting helped demonstrate how much more a popular song could say, and the Beatles were among the artists paying attention. But Paul's admiration for Dylan went beyond historical influence. McCartney has spoken openly about being a fan of Dylan's work. In 2020, when asked about Dylan's music, Paul said, "I always like what he does," before adding that sometimes he wished he could be a little more like him. He described Dylan as legendary and admired the freedom with which Dylan approached his music. That admiration has continued for decades. In 2026, McCartney was still describing himself as a Dylan fan, and one of the Dylan songs he selected among his favorites was Mr. Tambourine Man. It's an interesting contrast between two very different songwriters. McCartney has always been associated with melody, structure, and beautifully crafted pop songs. Dylan became famous for his distinctive voice, poetic lyrics, and willingness to follow his own artistic instincts. And yet Paul could look at Dylan's approach and admit that there was something about it he wished he possessed himself. That's perhaps the greatest compliment one songwriter can give another. Paul McCartney has spent a lifetime writing songs that other musicians admire. But even after all those years, he never stopped listening like a fan. And when a songwriter, As accomplished as McCartney openly admits that another writer can inspire him, challenge him, or even make him wish he were a little more like them. It reminds us that the greatest songwriters are often the biggest fans of great songs.